If we turned on your camera.
No, it's fine. All right, all is good. Oops. Okay, I think it's all set up. Yeah, that's fine.
No, this is gonna start. Get started. So, okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Needham from Florida State. He's taking the drive all the way down here just to give a talk in our math bio seminar. So thank you for joining us. He's in the math bio group at the Florida State Department of Math, but he does do a lot of pure math. And today he'll talk about his research, and I'm really looking forward to some of the cool math that he'll show us. So please take it away.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks, Youngman, for the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for coming to the talk. Yeah, so I'll talk about registration problems, applications to mathematical biology. As Youngman was saying, I'm in the biomath and the pure math groups, and I'm kind of more on the pure math side, and so I'll talk more about the kind of mathematics here to begin with, at least. But then the applications are mostly from biological problems, so I'll try to please everyone, I guess. Okay, so let me start with some motivation, some kind of concrete problems, and kind of describing the general philosophy of the stuff I'm doing. So I'll make this claim that in mathematical biology, you're frequently coming across data sets where each data point in the data set is itself a complex structured object. For example, you might have a data set where it's some ensemble of networks, for example. So here's protein-protein interaction networks where each node represents a protein, an edge is representing protein interaction. Maybe you have graphs that come from two different species, and say the function of the proteins in this species, you don't over here. So you know the kind of internal structure of these networks. So you might say, well, if I can align these two networks, then I can maybe infer function on the target set, okay, from the source set. So what does align mean? It means essentially I want to map from the nodes in the source to the nodes in the target, which is somehow preserving the structure of the graph when I transfer it over. So that's what I mean when I say alignment problem or registration problem. It's basically like I have these objects consisting of points, and I want to match points between the objects in a way which reflects internal structure. Other examples, surfaces. So we have some corpus callosum 3D scans here, and in this case, you want to, given scans from two different patients, you want once again a point registration between them, because then you can match common features maybe across the whole data set, or you can figure out which features in an unhealthy patient are not present in other patients. Something like this. Or kind of generically more complex objects. So in this picture, these are arterial networks. And I'm saying these are more complex than graphs because I don't only care about the topology of these things, like the connectivity structures. I care about maybe the shapes of the edges. So these are like artery networks in a human eye, and the shape of an artery might be indicative of a disease or something like that. So I care about this extra complex structure. But then once again, if I'm given a data set of a bunch of arteries, I want kind of point correspondences between them so that I can do the analysis and figure out what are the arterial structures that are uncommon for disease patient etc. Okay, so this is a summary of the kind of question I'm hinting at. How do we analyze a data set where the points in the data set are themselves complex objects? So there are different approaches to this. I've kind of hinted I want to do this kind of registration approach. I mean, you could also say, well, given a network, extract some summary statistics and then kind of work in this common summary statistics space. So this is the approach of something like topological data analysis or other kind of less fancy things. That's kind of a natural approach. I'm going to take the approach where I want to put a metric on the space of complex objects, which is based on these kind of point registrations. The reason being, that's less data loss, basically. So I'm remembering the structure of the objects. I'm able to kind of, when I make some inference in my analysis, I can kind of backtrack it and see geometrically where's that coming from, which you can't necessarily do if you're using summary statistics. Okay, so depending on your background, if I tell you that I want to register to different point sets and maybe they come from metric spaces, then the kind of canonical thing you might think of is Gromov-Hausdorff distance. If that's not your background, then let me explain what that means. So let's suppose now, for now, that my data objects are metric spaces. Like if you want a concrete example, just take your graph and put like the shortest path distance on it. I can think of this as a metric space. I can think of this as a metric space. I want to align these two metric spaces. So the Gromov-Hausdorff distance is a way to measure the distance between two metric spaces, which is based on some notion of alignment. So this is usually attributed to Gromov, hence Gromov-Hausdorff distance. I'll mention it was invented earlier by Edwards, who was a professor at my grad school alma mater, and people forgot about it, and Gromov rediscovered it. He was a mathematical physicist. Anyway, so what is it? So I'm taking two compact metric spaces, X and Y. I want to measure their distance. It's written as an infimization of a Hausdorff distance. Okay, so suppose that I've chosen some space Z and I've embedded my X and Y into Z. So take this picture. So here's my metric space X, here's Y, here's Z. I'm isometrically embedding these guys in the same space. I can measure the Hausdorff distance between them, which is given by this formula, or I mean, the formula doesn't really matter. Just think of it, it's measuring how much they overlap in some sense. Okay. So then, fine. If I have an embedding space, then I can measure Hausdorff distance. I get a number. That's some reasonable notion of the difference between X and Y. But then you say, where did that space Z come from? Like, how am I embedding these abstract metric spaces into some Z? And then the point is I infimize over all possible embeddings. Okay, which, like, I don't know if everyone's familiar with this, but it's like a totally wild idea, I think, when you first see it. I'm doing this optimization problem where the space I'm optimizing over is all metric spaces. Now, okay, so that's a little too wild sounding, I think. So you can reformulate this in various ways that look at least a little bit more computationally reasonable. So one way to do that is, yeah.
If you're doing this optimization over all metric spaces, how do you know there isn't a weird metric space where things would fall apart?
Fall apart in what sense?
Let's see, where, yeah, that's a good question, because I don't even know what I'm asking, like, because, I mean, for example, I guess a very concrete example would be thinking in terms of usual optimization on surfaces. You can get stuff in mobile minima. Is there an issue like that here in practice?
Certainly. I mean, I'll talk about the computational aspect in a bit. I mean, this is like really like wildly intractable to solve this. So I'll introduce something that's kind of like a convex relaxation in a second, but then even that you'll get stuck on local minima. There are all sorts of computational issues. Yeah. But yeah, actually kind of heading towards that direction of thinking about things computationally, here's a way to reformulate this distance. Instead of embedding, instead of optimizing over all embeddings, I can optimize over the space of what are called correspondences. So these are subsets of x cross y such that if I project onto the x coordinate or the y coordinate, it's surjective. Okay, so think like I have x, I have y. I mean, so if I have a surjective map from x to y and I graph it, that's a correspondence. But I can have wilder stuff, and maybe I put in this whole block or something. Okay. So graphs of surjective functions, but then it can be much wilder than that if I like. Okay, so that's what I'm infomizing over. And then the idea is I'm supposed to think of the correspondence as like some sort of correspondence between the spaces. So some sort of matching between the spaces, but it's sort of like a soft matching. It's not a function from one space to the other. It's like if I have a point x, y that lives in the correspondence, I think of x and y as being coupled together. Okay. Then what's my objective? I'm trying to infomize the distortion of the correspondence, which is to say, take a pair of points in the correspondence x and y. So these are points from different spaces that have been kind of coupled together, and do the same x prime, y prime, and then say, how different is the distance between those pairs? Okay. So x goes with y, x prime goes with y prime. How different are the distances? Okay, so it's this kind of relative comparison of the metric structure. And then I say, what's the worst case scenario? So the supremum over all things in the correspondence. Okay, so I'm trying to find the best correspondence, where best means least amount of metric distortion. This ends up being the same thing as Gromov-Hausdorff distance, up to a half vector. And this at least kind of looks more reasonable computationally. It's, I don't know, depending on whether you know where I'm going with this maybe or not. So here's the formulation. So this is just copy paste from the last page, just to remind us what's going on. Now this metric distortion, so this worst case metric distortion, I can think of this as an L infinity norm of the difference between dx and dy. Okay, so if I think of dx minus dy as a function from x cross y to r, then this is take the L infinity norm over r cross r of that. Okay, I'm writing it like this to suggest what we might want to change. So yeah, getting towards the computational side of things, if I'm trying to solve this optimization problem, first of all, I'm trying to optimize over subsets of x cross y, which doesn't feel like super nice to optimize over. And the thing I'm optimizing is an L infinity, which is like not very smooth and which is prone to kind of accentuate outliers. So these are kind of bad computationally in some sense. So I would like an LP version of this instead of L infinity. Okay. So I would like this to be an LP norm instead, so that I'm kind of taking an average of metric distortion instead of like worst case. I would like, instead of taking correspondences, I would like something like a weighted correspondence, where that would allow me to do something like gradient descent of this. So I could gradient descent on the weights in the correspondence. And then the LP norm would be smoother, and then this seems, I'm heading towards something I can at least approximate. So this was invented by Facundo Memoli. So this is what is called Gromov-Wasserstein distance, okay, instead of Gromov-Hausdorff distance. So the Wasserstein is referring to optimal transport. Now, in order for there to be an LP, I need measures lying around, okay, for that to make sense. So the thing we do is we kind of decorate our metric spaces with probability measures. And that's going to kind of allow us to hook onto something to integrate against, to do the LP norm. Okay, so if you buy all that, then I think that this is like kind of a natural generalization, or generalization isn't the right word, but this is a natural analog of this, like an LP relaxation or something. So indeed, I replace this L infinity norm with an LP norm. Okay, I replace correspondences with something like weighted correspondences. I'll explain exactly what that is in a second. But then I get this notion of Gromov-Wasserstein. Okay. If you want to write out what this is explicitly, it's this kind of nasty looking quadruple integral thing. Okay, so what do I mean by weighted correspondences actually? I mean probability couplings of the measures mu x and mu y. Okay. What does that mean? It means I take probability measures on x cross y such that when I project onto the coordinates and push forward that probability measure, I get my targets on x and y respectively. Okay. Could say that the marginals of pi are mu x and mu y if you feel like that sort of language. Okay. So on measures on the product space, which are somehow reflecting the measures on the spaces that I started with. Okay. And you can think of these as like weighted correspondences, where it's giving me kind of like the probability that a point in x should be paired with a point in y, rather than this kind of like hard matching thing that we have in correspondences. Okay, so then the fact is that this thing now defines a metric on the space of metric measure spaces up to some natural equivalence relation. And this is kind of the thing that I'll be using going forward to do registration problems in biological applications. Oh, well, I have to do one more technical slide first. Okay, so a thing you might observe is that, so here's now just the formulation of Gromov-Wasserstein distance from before. A thing you might observe is that when I write down this expression, it doesn't really matter that dx is a metric. Okay, like this would make sense if dx was any function from x cross x to r, just as an expression, right? So that's an observation that I mean, like, I'm sure somebody observed this before then, but I'll kind of attribute it to Peyre, Couturier, and Solomon, who have this paper that's coming from kind of a machine learning perspective, and they really spelled this out, that these can kind of be arbitrary kernels and this still makes sense, and that's actually useful. And so I attribute it here because this kind of like really popularized this framework in the machine learning community. Yeah, so for example, why do I care about things that aren't metrics? Dx could be like an adjacency matrix, okay? Or dx could be like the heat kernel of a graph or something like that. And using those representations of a space are quite useful for various reasons. Like adjacency matrices give you sparsity, and that's useful computationally. Heat kernels kind of smooth out the adjacency matrix and kind of help out with the optimization problem, things like this. Okay, so that observation was kind of formalized mathematically by Chowdhury and Maimoli a little bit later, and they basically just generalized the whole Gromov-Wasserstein framework, where they allowed the dx function to just be any bounded function. Okay, and then showed that this still has nice properties, so it's still a metric, but the up to some notion of isomorphism, which is a little bit weaker than what we have under the constraint that these are metric. Okay, I won't go into the details here, but it's a metric up to weak isomorphism. So when I say up to, I mean Gromov-Wasserstein distance is like symmetric, satisfies triangle inequality. If I plug in two of the same measure networks, I get 0, but it's possible to plug in two different measure networks and get 0. So the question is, can I say anything about which things give me 0? Okay. The answer is like, basically, if I take a measure network and leave the dx structure unchanged, but kind of just like rearrange mass. So going kind of from here to here, it's the picture. So I'm just moving mass around, but not really changing the distance structure. That's like a distance 0 move in this framework. Okay. So they pinned that down in a much less hand-wavy way, but this is the basic idea. Okay, so that's like kind of the background of where I'm starting at. Maybe any questions? This is all cool so far? Okay, so high level, there's a metric on the space of networks, and that metric is computed by finding probabilistic matchings between nodes. This is the idea, okay? Okay, so then with Samir Chowdhury and myself, based really heavily on work of Sturm from earlier, showed that if I take the space of measure networks with Gromov-Wasserstein P equals 2 distance, then that metric space has a nice structure. It's what's called an Alexandrov space of non-negative curvature. The details of that don't really matter. The point is that these are nice metric spaces in the sense that they kind of look like Riemannian manifolds. Okay, so that there's like notions of tangent spaces. There's notions of inner products on those tangent spaces. There's notions of geodesics, exponential and log maps, gradients, like everything that's good about a Riemannian manifold. There's some slightly weaker notion of that in metric spaces that look like this. Okay. So our proof of this is like basically Sturm's proof of kind of a related thing. The contribution of this paper is really implementing all this stuff computationally. Okay. So just to start with some simple examples, these are geodesics in the space of networks using the Skirmal-Wasserstein distance. Okay, so now the idea is it's really using this weak isomorphism, but the idea is like, so I start with this measure network. I want to end at this measure network. I want kind of the most efficient interpolation between these two. That's what I mean by geodesic. Now, first of all, observe that the number of nodes is different on the left and the right, and that's kind of what makes this interesting in some sense. I should say, given a graph, you have to decide how to represent it as a measure network, and the choice we're making here is that I use the adjacency matrix. Okay, same on the right side. Once I made that choice, then these guys are points in this metric space of all networks, and I want a geodesic interpolation between the two. The basic idea is like, I find an optimal coupling, so I solve this optimization problem. Okay, I use that to kind of search through the weak isomorphism class of this guy, and search through the weak isomorphism class of this guy, and I get these two representations. Once I do that, then I just literally interpolate them. Okay. And this is like provably the structure of the genus.
So as you interpolate, the distances between any two nodes sort of can change and then
Exactly.
but in the interior of this interval, is it always the same number of nodes? Like
yes. That's right. Yeah. So so the only time where we change kind of number of nodes is secretly I'm like adding nodes to this. You just can't see them because they're overlapped. Yeah, that's right. And so weak isomorphism, you're allowed to like kind of double nodes basically. But yeah, the interpolation, it's like the same dimensional matrix. Okay, and so I think that these look like kind of reasonable. These are just a couple other examples. And once again, the point is like, in this sort of framework, not only do we have a metric, which you can do whatever analysis you like with the metric, you have a metric which is computed by doing this registration problem, which allows you to kind of like visualize the point. Okay. And here's more examples. So this is using now instead to represent the graph, instead of using an adjacency matrix, I'll use a heat kernel. Okay. For bigger graphs, this tends to have empirically much better behavior for geodesics. Okay, so I didn't show the adjacency versions of these, but if I do the geodesic computation for adjacency representations, they look like very bad, super jumbled. These geodesics at least seem to preserve structure in some sense. So they're like qualitatively much more reasonable to okay. And then some applications besides just drawing like random pictures of geodesics, you can do things like compute Fréchet means. So if you don't know what I mean by that, you know, think of taking a mean of a bunch of vectors in Rn. Okay, you know how to do this. You can write that as a solution to a certain optimization problem, and that problem generalizes to any metric space. And solutions to that optimization problem are called Fréchet. So this is like taking a mean of a bunch of stuff in a metric space. So for example, here's just like some simple data set of graphs. Okay, they're all kind of similar, but I've added some random like extra edges as noise. I take a Fréchet mean, which should be like the mean of this set in the metric space of all networks, and the algorithm outputs this thing, which is like telling you what the underlying common structure is. And so this sort of thing is actually useful in practice if you have some biological data sets and you want to extract common structures from the data set. And the point is this computation is done using this Riemannian framework because you can, don't worry about actually reading this, but what it's telling you is that you can write down what the gradient is for the shape functional. And then you can just do gradient descent by following G at S6 along gradient directions.
These algorithms to find the Frechet means and the GNSX, I mean, you're showing us the results. Probably for these examples, you're not getting stuck in local mins, but do you know that to be the case, or in part of your examples, could you be stuck in?
You certainly could. So I'll talk. I'm like brushing a lot of stuff under the rug computationally right now, which the whole premise is that I'm able to find the optimal couplings.
Yeah.
And so these are like putatively optimal.
Right.
And probably these are fine, but definitely you get stuff in the
So
I think next slide or two I'll come back. And just one more application that's like more real is doing something like community detection in a graph. So this is the thing you want to do. You're handed a graph. It appears to have some community structure. You want to detect what the communities are. So we wrote an algorithm to do this using the Gromov-Wasserstein framework, specifically using heap kernel representations. And if you know stuff about spectral graph theory, it shouldn't be so surprising that this is a kind of useful thing to do. And the point I'm making here is like, okay, so we're doing this based on this general Gromov-Wasserstein framework, which is some metric on the space level network, some very general, but performance-wise, our algorithm is still competitive with things that were specifically designed for community detection. And we can beat these very specific community detection algorithms for certain graph data sets. And we can prove some theorems that say that the results you're getting are interpretable in some sense. Okay, yeah, so computation. So this relaxed LP version of Gromov-Hausdorff distance, this Gromov-Wasserstein distance, it's still NP hard, probably. Okay, I say probably because it's an instance of a quadratic programming problem, and in general, these are NP hard. I don't know that anybody's proved this for Gromov-Wasserstein specifically. Okay, as far as I know, that is open. But like almost certainly that's. So that means you need to approximate Gromov-Wasserstein distance, and kind of the most obvious approach would be to do gradient descent. This was kind of the whole point of using couplings, like the space of couplings is some convex polytope in a matrix space. I can gradient descend over that. I'm trying to infimize some functional of couplings. The functional is smooth because I'm using like an LT norm. So gradient descent is very doable. Okay. Now, of course, since this is NP hard, like of course you get stuck in local mins, and sometimes they can be like pretty bad. So we've done some empirical stuff. The other issue is that even if you just do gradient descent, you're evaluating this objective function, which involves 4 integrals, basically. So it's still like computationally taxing just to evaluate the objective function. So there's some tricks you can do, which brings something which looks end of the 4th down to end of the 3rd, which means that you can scale this so that it's like usable if the networks have like thousands of things. But that's about it. That it becomes not feasible. There's been some other recent approaches that try to speed this up using low rank approximations. So if you can low rank approximate your networks and then maybe low rank approximate your couplings, then you can boost this up. You can scale it better. So there have been a few different approaches to this. I'll mention ours. Works. Okay. Now it's a low rank approximation. So the lower the rank, the worse your results are going to be. Depending on how much you're willing to tolerate in terms of error, our thing scales up to like 1 million. Okay. While still giving reasonable results. So this is like qualitative assessment. Okay. Meaning like we're doing this thing we're calling segmentation transfer, which is like I have this room and the parts have been segmented into chairs and tables and blah, blah, blah. I have another point cloud representing a room where I don't know the segmentation. I do a Gromov-Wasserstein registration or alignment between the two, and then try to transfer segments over. And so this is like on the order of 1 million points, and it's at least picking up reasonable stuff. And that's kind of the hardest claim we made about the scaling power here, is that it's doing something reasonable on the order of 1 million. And there are some, we have theoretical results that can tell you something about the error, but it's like an error bound where the thing you're bounding by is also not computable. So it's like this very theoretical sort of error bound. I guess one more approach you can take is to find lower bounds on Gromov-Wasserstein distance, and then the lower bounds you can derive are themselves pseudometrics, and you can use these as proxies for Gromov-Wasserstein. And like this works okay. I don't tend to use this so much, but it can be useful if you have kind of simple problems, and this is enough sometimes. It leads to interesting theoretical questions. So you get these pseudometrics, which are based on distance distributions of your spaces, which is basically like, do something like take your distance matrix and histogram the entries, okay? And then kind of compare those histograms. So you can have two very different spaces which produce the same histogram in general. So there's theoretical questions about, are there classes of metric spaces where that doesn't happen, for example? Or where you can kind of pin something down a little bit more formally about that. Okay. All right. So let me actually talk about some bio math problem now. So here's an application which is actually inspired by a biological thing. So we're talking about shape graphs. So I say similar with 2 asterisks there, because there's a lot of technical differences between what I was just talking about and how we actually do this in practice, which I kind of just want you to ignore. And the point is, it's like the same sort of thing. So I'm going to define a metric on some space, which is based on registrations. Let's just say that. But okay, so what is a shape graph? So if you want to be fancy, it's like a one-dimensional stratified space embedded in Rn. But really, it's like a graph where each edge is made of like an actual curve. Okay, and you should be thinking like this picture of an artery system or something. Okay, so the topological structure of this from a medical or a biological perspective matters, but also potentially the shape of the arteries matter, right? When I'm trying to diagnose disease or something like this. So formally, it's sort of different than the situation we were in before, because it's still a graph-like thing where I have a function on vertices cross vertices, and then I'm going to spit something out. But this is like edge attributed, you might say. So the attributes on the edges are unparameterized curves in R2 in this picture, or Rn in general. The way we model the space of unparameterized curves is to think about the space of parameterized curves. And maybe this should really be immersions, but whatever. So I take smooth maps of an interval into Rn. There's an action on that space by the diffeomorphism group of the interval by precomposition. So these are reparameterizations. I mod out by that group action. And then the equivalence classes here represent unparameterized curves. Okay, so what's going on? I have this shape graph. I have 2 vertices, u and v. My g of uv returns a curve. Okay, and it's the curve that joins those 2. There's a question of what should I actually do if there's no edge between 2 vertices, and that this is like kind of a headache, but you can figure out something to do. And in the end, define a geodesic metric on the space of shape graphs, which is once again based on this idea of registering 2 shape graphs. So the details of this aren't so important, but the high level idea is that you still start by finding a point registration between 2 shape graphs. Okay, so now, let me just show you a couple applications of this. Excuse me.
I might have mentioned this already.
Yeah.
Would this work if if you have like these veins with 3D and they're projected down to 2D, is there a way to disambiguate?
Yeah, so, and I think that's actually kind of what's happening here, like, I think that the artery system of an eye is actually a tree, but it seems that we get crossings. So we don't really have a way to solve this right now, but it's a thing that we kind of should solve. But for now, we're just pretending that they're actually okay, so some applications, we can compute geodesics just like before. So here's a geodesic between eye arteries. Here's a geodesic between, I think, neuron shapes. Okay. Now, once we have geodesics, we can do this for Shay-mean trick, like I talked about earlier. And so this is more useful from a practical perspective. So I have some data sets of eye arteries. I compute the Fauché mean, and because everything's done in this geometric way, I can really visualize it. And I see that the darker red structures here are the kind of common shapes that appear in the data set. Okay, so they all have this kind of common, like, big artery here and a common one here, and then the other stuff is what's kind of variable. And I can pin that down even more. So we can do things like PCA. Now here the idea is as follows. So I have a data set, and this is a bunch of points in some metric space. Okay. Now I find a Fauché mean, which is some special point in that metric space. Then I also have a tangent space at that point. Okay, and because everything's like vaguely Riemannian here, I have a notion of a log map. Okay, which if you're not familiar, like, think on a sphere. I'm sitting at the North Pole, then I have a point that's somewhere else on the sphere. I can find a corresponding vector in that tangent space, and that's what's called the log map. Okay, so I can pull back points in the manifold to the tangent space. I can locally linearize the manifold. So I take my data set, find a Fauché mean, lift all of those points to the tangent space of the Fauché mean, and then I'm just in some vector space. So I can do whatever I want in that vector space. And the thing I want to do is PCA, of course. But now, once again, because everything's done in this very geometric registration way, I can visualize what PCA tells me. Okay. So here I'm visualizing PCA by following the geodesic for a short time along the first PCA direction, and then visualizing. Okay. And it's I think very clearly showing you that the main mode of variability in this data set is like kind of how they're bent up or down. And then as you tick down, the PCA is kind of less clear, but it seems like here maybe it's a certain branches kind of wiggling, and then here it's like maybe smaller branches wiggling, but you get this kind of very intuitive picture of variability in this geometric data set.
Have you tried how this compares it all to multidimensional scaling? Because they both sort of limit to PCA in the sense when you
So you mean just do MDS and then do PCA on the MDS?
or just do MDS on the initial, like if you have a metric on the initial sample shape graphs.
Yeah.
And you have a metric.
Yeah, so we're in a metric space here, and then I can do MDS.
And then just do MDS without finding the mean shape.
Sure, so then I get some embedding. But then what do I do with this? But I do PCA of the embedded thing. Okay, but then the issue is, can I lift that back up into the original space to do this sort of visualization trick? I think that's the point. It's kind of like everything is geometric, so I can visualize kind of everything if I do it.
So
And then one more example in the shape graph setting is you can use this to do sort of statistics, right? So I mean, basically, once you've done this trick where you're lifting to the tangent space, then you're just in a vector space, do whatever statistics you want. So here we had a data set of brain artery networks. Here are the kind of means of certain parts of the brain. And then we just ran some correlations with PCA scores versus age of the patient. And we see some fairly clear correlations, which is the interpretation is that the PCA directions are telling you something about the variability, which is like something that the main mode of variability is tied to age in the data set. Okay, and let's see, so maybe 5 more minutes, is that?
Yeah, no,
Right,
perfect.
okay.
So in that previous data set.
Yeah.
Could we go back to it first?
Yeah.
So then, can you go the other way where you just get a single piece of data from a patient and then be able to infer what their age is?
That's the idea, right? Yeah. So we haven't done too much in practice like this, but that's the idea, is you could use this like as a diagnostic tool, theoretically at least. But an issue is that the data sets that we have access to are kind of like not big enough to really be making these claims. I mean, this is like maybe 100 artery structures, and computationally also this is like quite taxing to compute these Fauché means. So that's kind of the goal, yeah, eventually to be able to do that. Okay, in the last few minutes, maybe I'll talk about one more project. But also kind of in the same theme. So we defined similar sort of structures in the setting of hypergraphs. Okay, so if you haven't heard this terminology before, this is like this very kind of simple-minded generalization of a graph. A graph is vertices and edges. What's an edge? It's a set containing 2 vertices. Think of it like that. Okay, so hypergraph is just allow the hyper edges to contain arbitrarily many vertices. So think of it as like a Venn diagram. Okay. So there's some biological motivation here. Working with an ecologist, Olivia Mason at FSU. She has all this really interesting data where she collected biology species concentrations at various locations in the Gulf here in Florida. Also environmental measurements at each of these locations. And the question is like, can you say something about combinations of environmental factors that certain species prefer, basically. So the plan, this is like super ongoing work in the early stages, but the plan is to take this data, threshold it to get a binary representation, and then turn that into a hypergraph. So here, each node is a location and each species is a hyperedge on some thresholded version of this. Okay. And then you can do the same thing with the kind of environmental matrix, and then do this sort of analysis where you're matching species and environments using these sort of optimal transport techniques. And then you can vary the threshold and think about this in a persistent way. Okay, but that's like kind of barely started. But in this paper, we generalized the notion of a measure network to a measure hypernetwork, which looks a little bit obnoxious now maybe, but now it's a 5-tuple. Okay, the idea is that X is like a node set. Okay, Y is like a hyperedge set. They have measures on them so that I can kind of do this relaxed LP type distance. And omega is some function which eats a node and a hyperedge and tells you something about how they're related. Okay, so think of it like an incidence function, basically. So then we generalize Gromov-Wasserstein distance, and I should really mention that this is inspired by this paper of Redco et al., who were doing this very similar thing in a machine learning context, and we kind of just formalized it as a mathematical thing. But basically, it's like Gromov-Wasserstein distance, but now I allow a coupling between nodes and a coupling between hyperedges, but I'm still just doing this LP type comparison of the incidence functions. So we show that this defines a complete geodesic metric on the space of measure hypernetworks up to some equivalence relation that's reasonable. So in this paper, we have a couple applications. One is hypergraph simplification. So the idea here is like, I mean, people have thought a lot about graph visualization. Of course, this is like very well developed. Hypergraph visualization is a lot harder because you're trying to visualize these super complicated Venn diagrams. So one approach you might take is just say, given a super complex hypergraph, can I simplify it in some principled way and then draw that and hopefully get some picture of the structure there. So basically we took work that Yuzha and they had done previously, and that their simplification technique is based on persistent homology. But then we just kind of quantified quality based on our metric and found, and it's kind of like this elbow method where we look for where there's a big jump in the distance. That's kind of like your max level of simplification that's reasonable, roughly. We're also, well, we have, in this paper, we have one application doing this kind of multi-scale shape registration. where the idea is you have like a centaur and a wolf or whatever, and you want to do this point registration because you love doing point registrations now, is what I'm advocating for. But maybe, I mean, there's computational issues with this, scaling and with local minima, and you might believe that you can kind of mollify these local minima issues if you kind of do matchings at a coarser level, and then maybe bootstrap those up to the final level. Okay. And that's basically the idea. And you can formulate this whole thing in kind of a hyper network formulation. Go from there. So we have one example like that in the paper, and we're kind of like trying to build that out more now to something viable. One last thing I'll mention. So in this paper, we think about category theory of hypernetworks a lot and kind of relate it to this whole framework. But that's beyond the scope of this talk. But my student Ethan will be here at UF on Monday in the applied topology seminar, and you should ask him about this. Okay. Okay, great. So I will end there. Yeah, so this was partially funded by NSF. Here are some references. Thanks everyone for listening.
Any other questions for our speaker?
So as I'm trying to think about like the data that you can use these methods on, is it that primarily anything that you can be represented as a graph, right? I mean, just like what's the difference between just like treating everything as equal?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so basically, you should think of it like anything that's a graph. Because I can think of a metric space as a graph. You just put ways in that reflect distance structure. So yeah, but you don't want to use Euclidean metric because like, what is the Euclidean metric? I'm just talking about a graph, right? So that's the idea. Yeah, the way I think of it is like graph data, and then these are all kind of like variants of that.
The example with the, what was it, a centaur and the.
I think it's a centaur. That's this beast, right?
Yeah.
That's a centaur. Okay.
You were saying that you moved into a hypernetwork framework. Are the inputs graphs that then turn into hypernetworks, or the inputs these hypergraphs?
So the input is like a mesh, like a dense mesh. Okay. And then in this paper, what do? We do some key kernel thing to kind of partition or soft partition the shape. We finally can open cover basically.
Gotcha.
And then we think of those as hyperedges. And then there's a relation between the dense nodes and the coarser hyperedges.
I see.
And then do the same thing here. And then you can kind of like work your way down and then bootstrap your way out.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I see. So it's related to the coarsening.
Related to the coarsening. So it's like really quite close to mapper actually. And in this project, we're specifically kind of trying to think about metrics on the space of mappers, which allow you to use like a variety of colors, right? And kind of think about those as coarsenings that result from mapper graph.
So here, do you at some point have like the nerve of this kind of over segmentation of this, and then you can kind of like move between those different coarsening levels?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly how.
Well, then if there are further questions, thank our speaker.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks so much.
It'll be going out to lunch soon, so if you want to join us. Welcome to it.
Where do we tend to go?
I don't know yet. Okay, so I'd have